The evening of August 12, 1985, was calm over Japan. The sun had begun to sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. At Tokyo's Haneda airport, families were saying their goodbyes, business travelers were checking their watches, and the Japan Airlines ground crew was preparing one of the busiest flights of the day, Japan Airlines Flight 123, bound for Osaka. It was a routine domestic flight, just 54 minutes in the air. Nobody on board could have known that those 54 minutes would turn into the longest, most terrifying 32 minutes in aviation history. On the tarmac stood a Boeing 747 short-range, designed to handle Japan's dense domestic routes. The plane was massive but familiar, a trusted workhorse that had carried millions safely before. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Masami Takahama, a veteran with over 12,000 flight hours, known for his calm demeanor. To his right was First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, younger but experienced, and behind them sat Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, the quiet technical mind ensuring everything functioned smoothly. The crew exchanged a few words of routine checks, weather reports, small talk about the evening ahead. Outside, 509 passengers boarded, some chatting, some tired, some distracted by thoughts of home. Among them were families with children, businessmen, vacationers, and a handful of airline employees traveling off-duty. At 6:12 p.m., Flight 123 pushed back from the gate. The engines roared to life, the plane rolled down the runway, and within minutes it lifted gracefully into the warm evening air. It was supposed to be an uneventful journey, a quick hops between two of Japan's busiest cities. But 11 minutes after takeoff, something unimaginable happened. At 6:24 p.m., as the aircraft climbed past 24,000 feet, a loud explosion tore through the rear of the plane. It wasn't a bomb. It was the rear pressure bulkhead, the structural wall that keeps cabin pressure stably, bursting apart with explosive force. In an instant, the cabin lost pressure. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling as the plane shuddered violently. Passengers screamed. Loose papers and bags whipped through the air. The flight crew's ears popped painfully. Alarms blared in the cockpit. The pilots struggled to understand what was happening, thinking perhaps a tire had burst or an engine had failed. But this was far worse. The explosive decompression had ripped away part of the plane's tail section, including the vital vertical stabilizer, and with it, the hydraulic line as a thin tubes carrying fluid that controlled every major surface of the aircraft that were severed. In one moment, the crew lost all control of the plane. Imagine a 747, a machine weighing over 300 tons, flying without any ability to steer, pitch, or brake. That was the reality of Flight 123. The yolks in the cockpit moved, but the control surfaces, ailerons, elevators, rudder did nothing. The plane began to pitch up and down violently, entering a deadly phagoid oscillation. The nose climbed steeply, slowing the aircraft, then dropped sharply as speed increased, only to climb again, a terrifying roller coaster no one could stop. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. The oxygen masks dangled uselessly for many, because the system's supply had been damaged in the explosion. Mothers clutched their children. Passengers cried, prayed, or sat frozen in disbelief. Some began writing farewell notes on whatever they could find: boarding passes, napkins, scraps of paper. These notes would later be found among the wreckage, final words from people who knew they would not survive. In the cockpit, Captain Takahama and his crew fought desperately to regain control. They throttled the engines unevenly, trying to steer with power instead of hydraulics, a nearly impossible task. By increasing thrust on one side and reducing it on the other, they discovered they could make the plane slowly turn. It wasn't precise, but it gave them a fighting chance. They radioed air traffic control, declaring an emergency, JAL 123. Uncontrollable. The controller's voice trembled as he tried to offer vectors back to Tokyo or toward the sea for an emergency landing. But nothing was easy. Every time the crew tried to descend, the plane's nose dipped too steeply, forcing them to climb again. The cycle repeated again and again, each oscillation stealing more control. At 6:35 p.m., the aircraft was over the mountains of central Honshu. The crew's breathing was heavy. The flight engineer scanned the instruments, but the hydraulic pressure gauges were flat as zero across the board. The captain's voice, calm but strained, filled the cockpit voice recorder. "We've lost all controls." The first officer tried the trim flaps. Anything and nothing responded. The plane was now flying on instinct and power alone. Below, people on the ground saw a massive aircraft swaying unnaturally in the sky, its nose bobbing up and down. Some thought it was performing maneuvers. Others knew something was terribly wrong. The aircraft left a long contrail of vapor and fuel as it struggled to maintain altitude. Inside the cabin, the oscillations felt like waves on a violent sea. Passengers were thrown against seat backs and overhead bins. Flight attendants, still trying to calm everyone, shouted over the roar of the wind. Some prayed with passengers. Others braced themselves, tears streaming silently. In those 32 minutes, time warped as seconds felt like hours. At 6:45 p.m., the crew somehow managed to keep the plane aloft near Mount Osutaka. They were exhausted but still fighting. Captain Takeoff tried to guide the crippled plane toward a flat area near Ueno village, hoping for a crash landing. Air traffic control relayed messages from JAL pilots and nearby aircraft, who offered to guide them. "Keep fighting," one pilot said. "You can make it." The response from Takeoff came with grim determination. "We're doing our best." But physics was unforgiving. The plane was bleeding altitude and speed. Every attempt to stabilize it only made it worse. The oscillations grew stronger, like a pendulum swinging wildly out of control. The mountains ahead loomed larger with each passing second. At 6:56 p.m., Japan Airlines Flight 123 struck the ridge of Mount Takamagahara at nearly 340 knots. The massive impact sent a thunderous explosion echoing through the valleys. The plane disintegrated across the mountainside, scattering wreckage over hundreds of meters. Fire consumed the forest. In an instant, 520 souls were lost, making it the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. But four miraculously survived: a 26-year-old flight attendant, a 12-year-old girl, and two women sitting near the rear section. They were pulled from the wreckage the next morning, clinging to life amid twisted metal and silence. For hours after the crash, the outside world didn't even know exactly where the plane had gone down. The Japanese self-defense forces had tracked radar blips, but communication was lost after 6:56. Rescue teams were delayed due to confusion about the crash site. Some villagers living nearby heard the explosion and tried to climb the mountain, but the dense forest and steep terrain made it nearly impossible. When rescuers finally arrived in the early hours of the next day, they found devastation and heartbreak. Fires still smoldered. The fuselage lay torn apart. Personal items, toys, briefcases, photographs were scattered across the hillside. In one small pocket of wreckage, they heard faint cries. That's how they found the survivors, injured, cold, but alive. Investigators later pieced together what had happened. 7 years earlier, the same aircraft had suffered a tail strike during a landing in Osaka. Boeing technicians repaired the damage, but crucially, they used an incorrect method. Instead of a continuous doubler plate, they used two separate pieces, creating a weak point. Over the years, with thousands of pressurization cycles, a tiny crack began to grow. On August 12, 1985, it finally gave way, and the rear bulkhead exploded outward. That single mistake you made years before you set off a chain of events that no one could stop. The investigation also revealed that after the bulkhead failed, the explosion blew off the tail cone, destroying the vertical stabilizer and severing all four hydraulic lines. Without hydraulics, even the world's best pilots couldn't control S-747. The crew's only hope was engine power, and they nearly succeeded. They kept the plane in the air for more than half an hour, something experts later called a miracle of skill and endurance. NASA even studied the cockpit voice recordings and flight data to understand how they managed to fly so long under impossible conditions. For the families of those aboard, the loss was immeasurable. Japan went into mourning. The emperor sent condolences. JAL's president publicly bowed an apology so deep and long it became symbolic of the nation's grief. Boeing representatives came to Japan and personally apologized, acknowledging the faulty repair. The tragedy changed aviation forever. It led to stricter maintenance oversight, improved repair documentation, and better emergency response systems. But for those who lived through ITA or lost someone aboard, no rule change could fill the void. Among the wreckage, investigators found many handwritten notes, messages from passengers to loved ones. "Please take care of the children. Thank you for everything. I love you." One note from a mother to her child simply said, "Be good, study hard, and live happily." These words became the heart of Japan's collective memory of Flight 123A, a reminder of how fragile life is and how courage can shine even in the darkest moments. The lone surviving flight attendant later described the final minutes. She recalled how the cabin lights flickered, how people held hands and prayed. She remembered the feeling of the aircraft tilting sharply before impact, then darkness and pain. When she awoke, she was surrounded by silence broken only by the crackling of fires and the chirping of insects. She called out for others, and faint voices answered. She held on through the night, listening to helicopters pass overhead, praying they would return at dawn. Those helicopters belonged to the Self-Defense Forces, which circled the crash site but initially misidentified it as too dangerous to approach in the dark. That decision cost lives. Later analysis suggested more survivors may have been alive for several hours after the crash. The guilt and controversy haunted rescuers for years. For Japan Airlines, Flight 123 became a permanent scar. The airline changed its safety culture, overhauled training, and built a memorial near Mount Osutaka. Every August 12th, families, airline staff, and even strangers climbed the steep trail to the site, laying flowers and folding paper cranes. The climb is quiet, solemn, and filled with the rustle of wind through trees that have long grown around the wreckage. Small fragments of metal still glint beneath the moss, a silent reminder of what happened there. Captain Takahama's final words on the cockpit recorder were steady, even as the aircraft plunged toward the mountains. "We cannot maintain altitude." A broken bar. All passengers braced for impact. There was no panic in his voice, only acceptance. His calmness, and the crew's desperate struggle, became symbols of professionalism and courage under unimaginable pressure. They didn't give up until the very end. For the families who received those farewell notes, time never fully healed the wound. Yet, many spoke of forgiveness, of turning grief into lessons that would prevent future tragedies. In the years that followed, Japan's aviation industry became one of the safest in the world, partly because of what was learned from those final 32 minutes. When survivors and rescuers returned to the site decades later, they describe an overwhelming sense of peace. The forest has reclaimed the mountain, the air is quiet, and the sound of wind through the trees feels almost like whispering voices. Some say you can still sense the weight of that night, up the pain, the bravery, the love left behind in hastily written notes. Flight 123's story is not just about failure or disaster. It's about humanity at its most fragile and most resilient. It's about a crew who refused to surrender, passengers who faced death with grace, and a nation that turned sorrow into vigilance. Every August, when bells ring in memory of the victims, people pause not only to mourn but to remember what those 32 minutes taught the world. That safety is built on responsibility, and that even in tragedy, there can be profound courage. As the years pass, the name Japan Airlines 123 still carries a chill. Aviation experts still analyze the data, pilots still study the flight path, and families still climb that mountain. The world may move forward, but that evening in 1985 remains frozen in time, when 524 people took off into a clear sky, and only 4 came back. When seconds stretched into eternity, and every heartbeat on board echoed the same silent prayer. The longest 32 minutes in aviation history were not measured only by time, but by the depth of human endurance, fear, and love. It was a tragedy written in the sky, but remembered forever on the ground, etched into the hearts of all who hear its story.